Can a political leader, often seen as an outsider, unite a party, charm a queen, and reshape a nation's destiny both domestically and on the global stage? Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 6, Episode 14, where we delve into Chapter 14 of Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, to explore the eventful ministry of Benjamin Disraeli. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a truly pivotal era, the first conservative government to command real power since way back in 1846. Just imagine, a comfortable majority, a party finally, pulling together and leading them, a figure unlike any Britain had really seen before. The historian Lytton Strachey, he summed up Disraeli's ministry as 6 years of excitement, of enchantment, of felicity, of glory, of romance. I mean, that's quite a billing, isn't it?
It really is. That's a high bar.
So our mission today is to unpack the sources that paint this vivid picture. We want to understand how this political outsider became such a dominant force.
And what's truly fascinating here, is just how improbable his whole rise was, given his background. It was completely unconventional. His ministry running from 1874 to 1880, it was absolutely eventful, like the chapter says. You see this unique blend of domestic social reforms and then this bold, almost flashy assertion of Britain's role on the world stage. So as we explore these sources, we'll look at how he managed such complex challenges, the sort of distinct vision he brought to politics, and also why this glittering period for the Conservatives eventually, fizzled out.
Okay, we've set the scene for this really fascinating period, but to truly get it, we need to understand the man himself. Let's peel back the layers on Benjamin Disraeli. He was quite the character. The son of a Jewish writer, self-educated and no Oxford for him, started out as a solicitor's clerk. And remarkably, he was also a novelist. Maybe that's where the dramatic flair comes from.
Could be, could well be.
And his public image. Oh, something else. Our sources call him a flashy dresser. There's this description of him in, wait for it, green velvet trousers, a canary-colored waistcoat, low shoes with silver buckles, lace at his wrists, and his hair in tightly curled ringlets.
Wow. Try picturing that in the comments today.
Exactly. And his maiden speech, just as memorable, but not in a good way. He was literally shouted down with catcalls and shrieks of laughter. Apparently his language was just too over the top. Not exactly a great start.
It's amazing, really. Despite all that and facing significant anti-Semitic feeling. I mean, even after his family had him baptized into the Anglican Church when he was 13, despite all that, he somehow managed to climb to the top of the greasy pole, as he famously put it. But our sources, they're pretty clear that Lord Derby's support was absolutely crucial. The historian John Charmley puts it bluntly, without Derby, Disraeli would have been nothing.
So Derby gave him legitimacy with the party establishment.
Essentially, yes. He needed that backing from the traditional landed Tory wing to accept someone so, different. And this leads us to his political philosophy, this idea of Tory democracy, or new conservatism. He really laid this out in his big speeches in Manchester and Crystal Palace in 1872. The key thing to grasp here is that Disraeli wasn't just making policy. He was actively trying to rebrand conservatism for this new, more democratic era. He saw, quite shrewdly, that the party had to win over the working classes to survive.
So what were the main ideas behind this Tory democracy?
Well, there were sort of 5 key strands. First, preserving tradition of the church, aristocracy, the monarchy, but, and this is the twist, insisting they use their power unselfishly for the whole community. Second, this idea of actively helping working people. He'd written his novel Sybil about the two nations, rich and poor. He really believed government and the upper classes had a duty here.
That famous quote about health comes from this period, right?
Exactly. In Manchester, he said, pure air, pure water, the inspection of unhealthy habitations. The first consideration of a minister should be the health of the people. It's a kind of paternalistic approach, one nation Toryism.
Looking after the masses to secure the position of the elite.
You could certainly see it that way. His phrase was something like, the palace is unsafe if the cottage is unhappy. So, third point, social reform as a way to forge an alliance, strengthening the existing order. Fourth, he argued, the Conservatives had to adapt to the industrial age, win that working class support, unlike the liberals who he painted as just serving the middle class and being, quote, anti-national.
And the fifth point?
Empire. Upholding Britain's power and prestige in the world. Defending and, importantly, extending the empire was central to his vision.
Okay, that's a compelling vision. But it does raise the question historians still debate. Was he genuinely driven by concern for the working class, this one nation idea? Or was it more about, clever politics, political calculation?
Ah, yes, the big debate. And the sources show plenty of skepticism. You've got historians like Paul Smith saying, look, Disraeli didn't really have a detailed reform program ready to go. A lot of it was piecemeal, sometimes pushed by others, like the liberal Samuel Plimsoll with the Merchant Shipping Act. Then there's Robert Blake, his main biographer, who suggests Disraeli wasn't that interested in the nitty-gritty details of social reform. Blake thinks it was more about outmaneuvering Gladstone, who was seen as neglecting social issues. Political point scoring, essentially.
Hard-headed politics rather than warm-hearted concern.
That's Blake's angle, yes. And T.A. Jenkins goes even further. He argues that Tory democracy and the big focus on imperialism were kind of built up after Disraeli's death, part of the myth-making, rather than a solid plan he had all along.
But hang on, even if the motives are debated, the reforms themselves did happen, right? They must have had an impact.
Absolutely, and that's the crucial counterpoint. We have to remember that major government intervention in social issues just wasn't the norm back then. You had the cost, but also this strong laissez-faire ideology, keep the government out of it. So, as Ian St. John points out in our sources, Disraeli could have just ignored calls for reform. Instead, he actually made time available for reform and championed the process with supportive rhetoric. He gave conservatism a way to connect with working-class voters.
And did the voters respond?
Seems like it. The 1874 election results in Lancashire, the industrial heartland, are telling. The Conservatives won 18 out of 25 seats there. That suggests working people really did have expectations based on Disraeli's promises.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. What did this one-nation Toryism actually deliver for people on the ground? What were the key reforms?
Well, the early years, especially 1875 to 76, were pretty productive. You get major legislation on public health and housing, the Public Health Act, the Artisans' Dwellings Act. These were big deals, largely worked out by his Home Secretary, Richard Cross.
Cleaning up the cities, basically.
That was the aim. Plus, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act tackled adulterated food, a huge problem. The Enclosures Act protected common land, sort of an early version of the Green Belt idea, and they made it illegal to dump industrial waste into rivers.
Sounds quite comprehensive. Did it work?
According to B.H. Abbott, quoted in Lowe, yes. He says that legislation laid the foundations of modern public health so thoroughly that no major changes were required for over 60 years. That's quite an endorsement. Mind you, the Artisans' Dwellings Act wasn't as effective as hoped because it wasn't compulsory for local authorities.
Right. And industry itself, factories.
Yep, reforms there too. The Factory Acts of 1874 and 1878 brought in important new limitations on working hours, especially benefiting women and children. But maybe the most significant breakthrough was in labor relations with trade unions. Two key acts. The Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act in 1875 made peaceful picketing legal. Crucially, it meant unions could act together without facing conspiracy charges. This was a huge win for them, fixing issues left over from the liberals. Then, the Employers and Workmen Act in 1876 leveled the playing field a bit in contract disputes. Before, if a worker broke a contract, it was a criminal offense, but for an employer, it was civil. This act made both civil cases.
Putting them on an equal footing, legally speaking.
Exactly. Disraeli himself thought these laws would win over the working classes long term, and they were a massive step in recognizing unions' rights. Even if new challenges came later with the rise of unions for unskilled workers, the new unionism.
And education. You mentioned Sandon's Act earlier.
Yes, the Education Act of 1876. It aimed to boost school attendance, but again, it lacked real teeth because it wasn't fully compulsory, so less impactful than it might have been.
But the story around the Merchant Shipping Act is just incredible. Samuel Plimsoll and the coffin ships.
Ah, yes, a truly dramatic episode. The problem was these unscrupulous ship owners deliberately overloading old, heavily insured ships. If they sank, the owners collected the insurance, never mind the sailors who drowned. Awful practice.
And Plimsoll campaigned against this.
Fiercely, he led a vigorous campaign, but Parliament was dragging its feet. Plimsoll apparently got so frustrated during a debate that he completely lost it. Our source says he was literally jumping up and down with rage and shaking his fist at Disraeli right there in the Commons.
Wow. Did that actually work?
Amazingly, yes. The public outcry and Plimsoll's sheer passion forced the government's hand. The Merchant Shipping Act was passed in 1876.
And that gave us the Plimsoll line.
That's the one. The line painted on ships showing the safe loading level, a very visible reform. Though it has to be said, ship owners found loopholes initially, and it wasn't fully effective until about 1890.
Still, it shows how sometimes, drama and public pressure really can drive change, even with someone like Disraeli.
Absolutely. It captures that interplay with Disraeli, the grandstanding, the public image, but also leading a government that did deliver some tangible reforms, even if they needed a push sometimes.
Okay, so alongside these domestic changes, Disraeli was absolutely focused on boosting Britain's image abroad, restoring prestige. What was his vision for the empire?
Well, imperialism itself, the basic idea, is about a stronger power dominating a weaker one. But Disraeli added this new dimension. He talked about Britain's duty to bring British civilization, things like courage, discipline, law, to what he called primitive
A
peoples.
precursor to the white man's burden idea.
Pretty much, yeah. And it was, of course, based on this false assumption of a European racial superiority. Now, this whole approach was controversial even then. Gladstone hated it, thought it was expensive, immoral, just sheer greed. But others, like historians Max Beloff and Neil Ferguson mentioned in Lowe, argue profit wasn't the main driver. They suggest British rule brought benefits like law and order, better governance. For Disraeli, though, the key seemed to be projecting British power, often in quite dramatic ways.
Like the Suez Canal shares purchase, that seems like classic Disraeli.
Oh, absolutely classic. A splendid piece of opportunism, as Lowe calls it. So in 1875, the ruler of Egypt, the Khedive, was in debt and needed to sell his large block of shares 716ths in the Suez Canal Company.
Which was vital for Britain's route to India.
Critically important, there was a real worry a French company might snap them up, giving France total control. Disraeli acted incredibly fast. He got a £4 million loan from the Rothschild banking family, literally almost overnight, and bought the shares for Britain.
A bold move.
Hugely bold. It stopped the French, secured the route, dazzled the public, and actually turned out to be very profitable. But Gladstone, he was furious, called it ruinous and mischievous, and famously predicted it would inevitably lead to Britain occupying Egypt.
And history proved him right on that one.
Eventually, yes, it took a few years, but it happened.
Then there was Queen Victoria becoming Empress of India in 1876. Another grand gesture.
Interestingly, this one wasn't originally Disraeli's idea. It was actually the Queen who wanted the title. But Disraeli, ever the charmer with Victoria, ran with it and pushed the Royal Titles Act through Parliament.
Despite opposition.
Yes, surprisingly strong resistance, actually. Gladstone called it theatrical bombast. But there were two main reasons behind it. One, to show Britain was committed to India for the long haul, hoping the personal title would appeal more to Indians than rule by Parliament.
And the second reason?
Russia. It was a symbolic warning shot. The Russians were expanding in Central Asia, getting closer to India's borders, so this was meant to signal Britain's determination to hold on to its prize.
Okay, so Suez and India seem like calculated moves,
Yeah.
but not all his imperial ventures went smoothly. The Zulu War sounds like it was messy.
Very messy. And Lowe is clear. The Zulu War of 1879 was not planned by Disraeli. Apparently, he was furious when it broke out. This was a classic case of men on the spot exceeding their orders.
Man on the spot.
Yeah, local officials making decisions that dragged the home government into conflict. In South Africa, you had this complex situation with British colonies, Boer republics, descendants of Dutch settlers, and powerful African kingdoms like the Zulus under King Cetewayo. Disraeli's colonial secretary, Lord Carnarvon, had this dream of federating all of South Africa under British control. But the independent Zulu kingdom was a major obstacle.
So the local commander decided to remove the obstacle.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The High Commissioner, Sir Bartle Frere, despite explicit orders from Disraeli not to start a war, decided the Zulus had to be dealt with and launched an invasion in January 1879.
And it started badly for the British.
Disastrously. At Isandlwana, the main British force under Lord Chelmsford was virtually wiped out, over 1,000 men lost. There was the famous defense at Rorke's Drift soon after, which was a small victory, but the overall picture was grim. Public outcry back home was huge, especially when the French Prince Imperial, who was observing, got killed.
What did Disraeli do?
He was in a tough spot. He eventually sent reinforcements, and Chelmsford managed to defeat the Zulus decisively at the Battle of Ulundi. But the whole thing was widely seen as an unjust, unprovoked attack. It cost a lot of money and lives.
And created new problems.
Exactly. With the Zulu threat gone, the Boers in the Transvaal state immediately started demanding their independence back, which Britain had recently annexed. It was another headache left for Gladstone to deal with when he came back to power.
So Zulu War, driven by local ambition. What about the Afghan Wars? Similar story.
Very similar dynamic, yes. Afghanistan was strategically vital as a buffer state between British India and the expanding Russian Empire. Disraeli wanted to maintain influence but avoid war. However, his Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, described as an advocate of expansionist imperialist policies and, curiously unbalanced in judgment, had other ideas. When a Russian diplomatic mission arrived in Kabul, Lytton saw it as a challenge.
Ignoring orders again.
Disregarded Disraeli's cautious instructions and sent a large British force, 35,000 troops, into Afghanistan. This kicked off the Second Afghan War. There was initial success, but then the British envoy in Kabul was murdered, leading to more fighting, essentially a third Afghan war. General Roberts eventually restored control, but Disraeli's government fell before it was fully resolved.
So more criticism back home.
Oh, yes. Liberals slammed it as a wanton invasion, though some sources argue that Lytton's aggressive, if unauthorized policy did ultimately scare off the Russians and kept them out of Afghan affairs for about 20 years. So a mixed legacy, perhaps.
Before we get to why his government fell, just quickly, what was Disraeli's take on Ireland?
Well, the sources suggest he had no understanding of small nations, really. He saw Ireland mostly as a troublesome possession rather than a nation with its own aspirations.
So no sympathy for home rule.
Absolutely none. He strongly opposed it. And when Ireland suffered a really severe agricultural depression with mass evictions, he remained pretty unmoved and wholly out of sympathy with the Irish. It was just a problem to be managed from his perspective.
Right. So bringing it all together, the social reforms petering out, these messy, expensive wars in Africa and Afghanistan. Despite his early successes in that image as this master diplomat, the Conservatives got hammered in the 1880 election. Why the sudden fall?
It was a combination of factors, really. First, those overseas disappointments you mentioned. The Zulu mess, the ongoing fiasco in Afghanistan, they really spoiled the image he'd crafted, especially after his perceived triumph at the Congress of Berlin dealing with the Eastern question. His foreign policy magic seemed to be wearing thin.
And domestically.
Well, the momentum on social reform stalled after 1876, partly because Disraeli himself was so focused on foreign affairs, but also because the Irish Home Rule MPs in Parliament started using obstruction tactics, basically grinding parliamentary business to a halt. So not much new legislation got through.
And the economy played a part.
A huge part. Britain was hit by two major downturns simultaneously. First, an industrial slump. Unemployment among union members shot up from just 1% in 1872 to over 11% by 1879. This was the beginning of what historians call the Great Depression of the late 19th century, a long period of falling prices and slower growth, largely due to foreign competition catching up. And second, agriculture was devastated. A run of really wet summers ruined harvests, just as cheap grain started flooding in from North America thanks to new railways and steamships. Farmers went bankrupt, laborers lost jobs.
Didn't Disraeli try to protect them with tariffs?
Ironically, no. He refused to bring back tariffs on imported corn, arguing it would raise food prices for the urban working class, the very people his Tory democracy was supposed to appeal to. But it completely alienated the farming interest, a traditional Tory base.
And then there was Gladstone.
Gladstone. He had officially retired from the Liberal leadership, but he came roaring back. He launched this incredible speaking tour, the Midlothian campaign, denouncing Disraeli's policies with almost religious fervor. He called them immoral and iniquitous. The Afghan War. A crime against God, Cyprus acquired after the Congress of Berlin. A valueless encumbrance.
Quite the contrast in energy levels, too.
Absolutely. Gladstone was over 70 but seemed tireless. Disraeli was nearly 80, suffering from gout and bronchitis, really in failing health. He just couldn't mount an effective response. Added to that, the Liberal Party machine, organized by Joseph Chamberlain, was running like clockwork, while the Conservative organization had got complacent since '74 and was caught unprepared.
So, a perfect storm, really. After the defeat, Gladstone's comment was pretty cutting. The downfall of Beaconsfieldism is like the vanishing of some vast, magnificent castle in an Italian romance. Was he right? Was it all just a show with no lasting substance?
Well, that's the final question, isn't it? And historians, as ever, are divided. Looking at the positive legacy, Robert Blake argues Disraeli's real achievement was holding the Conservative Party together during a very tough transition. He showed it could govern effectively in a more democratic age. Blake says he made the Conservatives the party of the empire and the party with a strong foreign policy, which helped attract working-class votes and ensure the party survived as a major force when it could easily have faded.
And the Tory democracy idea?
T.A. Jenkins suggests that even if it wasn't fully formed in Disraeli's time, He did lay the foundations. He made the Conservatives feel like a genuinely national party, not just sectional. And that idea of Tory democracy certainly inspired later Conservatives, especially after the Liberals split over Irish Home Rule in 1886, which drove many wealthy industrialists towards the Tories.
But there are dissenting voices.
Oh, yes. Paul Smith, for example, argues it was actually Robert Peel who truly modernized the Conservatives earlier in the century, and Disraeli, by attacking Peel, actually retarded its development. And it's pointed out that Disraeli's successor as Conservative leader, Lord Salisbury, largely abandoned the social reform agenda. So you could argue that key part of Beaconsfieldism didn't really last beyond Disraeli himself.
So maybe statesman, maybe showman, maybe a bit of both. But you can't deny his unique style.
Absolutely not. Whatever the final judgment on his policies, his personal skill as a politician, a parliamentarian, was extraordinary. Blake's description is perfect. An impresario, an actor-manager. There is a champagne-like sparkle about him which has scarcely ever been equaled and never surpassed among statesmen.
So you've seen how Disraeli, this ultimate outsider, managed to charm a queen, reshape his party, navigate a growing empire, often with this incredible flair, and yeah, a real sense of theater.
And this deep dive really shows how his personal ambition, all that clever political maneuvering, those grand gestures, how they all got tangled up with actual concrete reforms that did change Britain, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, and certainly shaped things for decades.
It really leaves us with a question for you, the listener, to think about. To what extent can just one person, one charismatic individual, truly change the direction of a whole nation? Especially when their actions and motives remain so open to interpretation, even all these years later.